The Pacific Ocean is the biggest thing on Earth. It covers almost a third of the planet. During the Second World War, this ocean became a battlefield. It was a war fought over distances that are hard to imagine, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, from the skies over Tokyo to the deep dark waters off the Philippines. Millions of men and women were caught in a conflict that stretched across thousands of islands and millions of square miles of water. In a war this big, it's easy to get lost in the numbers. The number of ships sunk, the number of planes lost, the number of lives ended. But behind those numbers are stories. Stories of individual people faced with impossible choices. People who were cold, hot, tired, and scared. People who, for a moment, did something extraordinary. Something that most of us hope we'd have the courage to do, but are glad we'd never have to find out. What makes a person run toward danger when everyone else is running away? What happens in the mind of a pilot who decides to fly his damaged plane into an enemy ship? How does a medic who refuses to carry a weapon become one of the most decorated soldiers in a battle? These aren't just stories about war, they are stories about human limits, and what happens when those limits are pushed, broken, and redefined. This is a look at 15 of those moments. 15 acts of bravery that remind us what people are capable of, for better and for worse, in the middle of the fight that spanned an ocean. Number 15, how do you fight for a country that doesn't trust you? After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, fear and paranoia swept across the United States. This fear was aimed squarely at Japanese Americans. It didn't matter if they were citizens. It didn't matter if their families had been in the country for generations. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the military to create exclusion zones. It led to the forced relocation and incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry. Most were American citizens. They were sent to internment camps, living behind barbed wire in the middle of their own country, and yet from these very camps, thousands of young men volunteered to fight for that same country. They wanted to prove their loyalty. They wanted to show they were Americans. They formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Their motto was, "Go for broke," a Hawaiian pidgin phrase from gambling that meant risking everything on one roll of the dice. You know, that's what they were doing. They were risking their lives for a nation that had imprisoned their families. While the 442nd is most famous for its incredible combat record in Europe, its story is rooted in the Pacific. It was formed in Hawaii and the mainland US, pulling from a community shattered by the war. These Nisei, or second-generation Japanese Americans, had to fight a war on two fronts. One was against the enemy overseas, the other was against prejudice at home. They trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where they faced segregation and suspicion. But their performance and training was exceptional. The unit was eventually sent to Europe, where they became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. They earned more than 18,000 awards in less than 2 years, including over 4,000 Purple Hearts and 21 Medals of Honor. One of its members was a young second lieutenant named Daniel Inouye. He lost his arm charging a series of machine gun nests in Italy and would later become a U.S. Senator for Hawaii. His Medal of Honor citation reads like something from a movie. He was shot in the stomach but kept fighting. He was about to throw a grenade when his right arm was shattered by a rifle grenade. The live grenade was still clenched in his useless hand. He pried it out with his other hand and threw it, taking out the enemy position before being shot in the leg and finally collapsing. The bravery wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in the very act of enlisting. It was the courage to wear the uniform of a country that saw your face and saw the enemy. It was the quiet dignity of fighting for the ideals of a nation even when that nation failed to live up to them. The story of the 442nd is a complex story of patriotism. It shows that loyalty isn't about where your parents came from. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice for what you believe in. The irony was brutal. As these men were bleeding on foreign soil, their parents, brothers, and sisters were living as prisoners, their loyalty questioned every single day. The definitive history of the unit can be found in books like Chester Tanaka's Go for Broke, a pictorial history of the Japanese-American 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The legacy of these men forced a conversation in America about race, loyalty, and citizenship. They didn't just fight a war. They fought for the soul of their country. But what do we still not know? We have the official records and the citations, but what about the letters they sent home to the camps? What did a soldier write to his mother who was living behind barbed wire? How did they explain the contradiction of fighting for freedom while their own families were not free? And what was it like for them to come home, not to a parade, but to a country that was still deeply suspicious of them? Number 14 is the real fight after the battle is over. On July 30th, 1945, the war in the Pacific was almost over. The cruiser USS Indianapolis had just delivered key components for the atomic bomb to the island of Tinian. Its mission was secret and successful. Now, it was sailing unescorted from Guam to Leyte in the Philippines. Just after midnight, 2 torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-58 slammed into its side. The ship, which had survived so much of the war, sank in just 12 minutes. Of the 1,195 men on board, about 900 made it into the water. Their ordeal was just beginning. This wasn't a story of combat bravery. It was a story of survival. The men were scattered across the open ocean. They had few life rafts and almost no food or water. The tropical sun beat down on them during the day. The water was cold at night, but the worst part was the sharks. The sinking of the Indianapolis resulted in the greatest single loss of life at sea from a single ship in the history of the U.S. Navy. But most of those deaths didn't happen in the initial attack. They happened over the next 4.5 days. The men floated in groups trying to keep each other alive. They were plagued by dehydration, exposure, and saltwater poisoning, which caused hallucinations. Men would scream that the ship was just below the surface, full of fresh water, and swim down, never to return. And then there were the sharks. Drawn by the explosion and the blood, hundreds of oceanic white-tipped sharks surrounded the survivors. They picked off the dead and the wounded first. The men learned to stay in groups, kicking and splashing to keep the predators at bay. But as the days wore on, and men grew weaker, the sharks grew bolder. The Navy didn't even know the ship was missing. Due to a series of communication errors and misunderstandings, no one was looking for them. They were completely alone. The deliverance came by accident. On the 4th day, a patrol bomber flown by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn happened to spot the oil slick and the heads bobbing in the water. A massive rescue operation was launched, but by then, only 316 men were left. The story is captured in wrenching detail in Doug Stanton's book, In Harm's Way. It's a story of human endurance pushed to its absolute limit. The bravery here wasn't about charging an enemy. It was about finding the will to live for one more hour. It was about a friend holding on to you when you wanted to give up. It was about the fight against your own mind as it started to betray you. The aftermath was tragic. The ship's captain, Charles B. McVay III, survived. What he was court-martialed for, hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. He was the only captain in U.S. history to be court-martialed for losing his ship in an act of war. For years, he received hate mail from the families of the men who died. In 1968, he took his own life. Decades later, research by the survivors, including a school project by a young student named Hunter Scott, helped clear his name. In 2000, Congress passed a resolution exonerating him. But what secrets did those waters keep? The survivors' accounts are harrowing, but trauma can blur memory. How many men were actually lost to sharks versus dehydration or drowning? What were the final thoughts of the hundreds who slipped away in the dark? And we will never know the full extent of the command failures that led to a ship with over 1,000 men simply vanishing from the Navy's radar for almost 5 days. Number 13, how fast does a man have to think to survive? The sky was a chaotic mess of planes and bullets. Being a fighter pilot in the Pacific was a job with a short life expectancy. You were strapped into a thin metal shell, thousands of feet in the air, trying to shoot down an enemy who was trying to do the same to you. It required a unique kind of courage. It wasn't just about being fearless, it was about being smart, fast, and incredibly skilled. And America's top ace of all time was a man named Richard Bong. Bong was a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin. He wasn't the stereotypical swaggering fighter pilot, but in the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, he was a master. He shot down 40 Japanese aircraft, a record that has never been broken by an American pilot. What made him so good? And he was an incredible marksman. He could fly his plane with an almost unnatural grace, and he had an uncanny ability to see things before they happened, to anticipate the enemy's move. His commanders saw he was too valuable to lose. They tried to keep him out of combat. In late 1944, they sent him home to be an instructor and to go on a public relations tour. He got married, but Bong felt he belonged in the air. He eventually went back to the Pacific, not as a combat pilot, but to test new jet aircraft. The war was ending, and the age of propeller planes was giving way to the age of jets. His story is one of incredible skill and sustained bravery over a long period. Each of his 40 victories was a life or death situation. He flew a plane with the faces of his future wife Marge painted on the nose. It was called Marge. He survived over 200 combat missions. He once took on a whole formation of enemy fighters by himself, diving through them and scattering them before picking them off one by one. General George C. Kenney, his commander, said of him, "We sent him home to get married. I was going to make sure he stayed home." The details of his career are laid out in biographies like America's Ace of Aces, The Dick Bong Story by Bill Yen. Bong received the Medal of Honor for his actions between October 1943 and November 1944. He consistently chose to attack even when outnumbered. He would fly dangerously close to his targets to make sure he didn't miss. Sometimes so close he would fly through the debris of the exploding enemy plane. But his story has a tragic end. The man who survived so much combat, who faced down enemy planes hundreds of times, died on August 6, 1945. The same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He was test flying a P-80 Shooting Star, America's first jet fighter. The plane's fuel pump failed on takeoff. He ejected, but he was too low to the ground. Richard Bong, the greatest fighter ace in American history, was killed not by the enemy, but by his own machine in a time of peace. But what are the unanswered questions about men like Bong? How do they manage the psychological strain of daily mortal combat? Did they become numb to it, or did the fear just get buried deeper? We know what he did in the air, but what did he think about at night, alone with his thoughts? What went through his mind in those last few seconds as the jet fighter failed and he knew the odds had finally run out? Number 12. What does it take to hold a lost cause? In the first few months after Pearl Harbor, the news from the Pacific was bad. It was a string of defeats. The Allied forces were in retreat everywhere. One of the earliest and most symbolic battles was the defense of Wake Island. Wake is a tiny speck of coral in the middle of the Pacific, little more than an airfield and a refueling stop. It was defended by just over 400 U.S. Marines, a handful of sailors and Army personnel, and about 1,200 civilian construction workers. They had a few old planes and some coastal defense guns. On December 8th, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese bombed Wake Island. 3 days later, they tried to land. The small force of Marines, led by Major James Devereux, fought them off. They used their 5-inch coastal guns with deadly accuracy, sinking 2 Japanese destroyers. It was one of the first pieces of good news in the war, a small victory against an overwhelming tide. The story, possibly exaggerated, went out that when asked what he needed, the commander on Wake radioed back, "Send us more Japs." The phrase became a rallying cry back in the States, but they couldn't hold out forever. The Japanese came back, this time with a much larger force, including aircraft carriers. For 2 weeks, the small garrison on Wake Island held on. They were bombed daily. Their planes were destroyed. They were running out of ammunition. They were completely cut off. A relief force was sent, but it was controversially ordered to turn back, fearing a trap. The men on Wake were on their own. On December 23rd, the Japanese launched a second, much larger amphibious assault. The Marines fought them on the beaches in the dark. The fighting was hand to hand, but the numbers were just too great. With his men scattered, many wounded, and facing an impossible situation, Major Devereux surrendered. The defense of Wake Island was over. The survivors were taken as prisoners of war. They would endure years of brutal captivity. The story of Wake Island is a classic tale of a small, determined force holding out against impossible odds. It's detailed in books like Given Up for Dead by Bill Sloan. The bravery wasn't just in the initial successful defense. It was in continuing to fight for 2 weeks, knowing that help was probably not coming. It was the courage of the civilian workers, many of whom picked up weapons and fought alongside the Marines. It was the bravery of continuing to man your gun position while bombs fell all around you. But what don't we know about the Siege of Wake? As someone who asks more Japs, send us more Japs message is likely a myth created by a stateside journalist, but what was the real communication between the islands? How close did the American relief force actually get? And what was the true reason for the order to turn back? What were the final desperate conversations among the Marines on the beaches as they realized they were about to be overrun? Number 11. When is surrender not an option? The Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. The year is 1942. American and Filipino forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, are trapped. They have been pushed back by the Japanese invasion, their supplies are cut off, They are running out of food, medicine, and ammunition. They are racked by malaria and dysentery. For months, they held out, hoping for reinforcement that never came. On April 9th, 1942, some 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers on Bataan surrendered. It was the largest surrender in American military history. Their fight was over, but their test of bravery had just begun. What followed was the Bataan Death March. The prisoners were forced to march some 65 miles to a prison camp. They were given almost no food or water. The tropical heat was relentless. The Japanese guards were brutal. Men who fell behind were shot, beheaded, or bayoneted. Men who tried to get water from roadside wells were killed. The march was a long, slow, waking nightmare. Thousands died along the way. The bravery here was not of the battlefield, it was the bravery of endurance. It was the courage of one man helping another to his feet, knowing it could get them both killed. It was the quiet defiance of looking a guard in the eye. It was the sheer stubborn refusal to die. It was also the incredible bravery of the Filipino civilians who, at great risk to their own lives, tried to throw food and water to the marching prisoners. Many were killed for these acts of compassion. Those who survived the march faced years of hell in prisoner of war camps like Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan. The conditions were horrific. Starvation, disease, and brutal treatment were daily realities. The story of these men is one of the darkest chapters of the war. It's chronicled in memoirs like Ghost Soldiers by Hampton Sides, which focuses on the later raid to rescue the survivors. The Bataan Death March was a demonstration of extreme cruelty, but it was also a demonstration of the resilience of the human spirit. The men formed bonds in captivity. They shared what little they had. They tried to maintain their military discipline and their dignity in a situation designed to strip them of both. They were men who had been defeated in battle, but they refused to be broken as human beings. But what are the lingering questions? We know the broad strokes of the horror, but how many Filipino civilians were killed trying to help the prisoners? Their stories are largely unrecorded. What were the names of the Japanese officers who ordered and oversaw this brutality, and what happened to them after the war? And for the survivors, what was the true long-term psychological cost of witnessing and enduring such inhumanity? How does a mind ever recover from that? Number 10, can a single person change the course of a battle? Saipan, 1944. The battle for the island was one of the most brutal of the Pacific War. The U.S. Marines were fighting a determined Japanese force that was dug into caves and fortified positions. The fighting was slow, bloody, and costly. The Japanese soldiers had been told that the Americans were barbarians who would torture and kill them if they surrendered. So they fought to the death. Civilians on the island, also convinced by propaganda, were taking their own lives by the thousands, jumping from cliffs rather than be captured. Into this hell walked a 20-year-old Marine, private first class, from Los Angeles named Guy Gabaldon. Gabaldon was not a typical Marine. He was a Mexican-American who had been raised in East LA by a Japanese-American family. He spoke fluent, colloquial Japanese. He understood the culture, and he thought the way the war was being fought on Saipan was a waste of life for both sides. So he did something unbelievable. He would go off on his own, against orders. Often at night, he would approach a cave or a dugout where he knew Japanese soldiers were hiding. And he would start talking to them. He wouldn't shout threats. He would speak to them in their own language. He'd tell them that the Americans weren't monsters. He'd promise them they would be treated well, that they would get food and medical attention. He'd tell them the war was lost for them and that dying served no purpose. His first success was convincing 2 soldiers to surrender. He brought them back to his lines. His commanding officer was furious that he had gone off alone, but he was also amazed. So he gave Gabaldon permission to keep trying. Over the next few weeks, Guy Gabaldon, acting mostly by himself, convinced over 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians to surrender. His greatest accomplishment came when he single-handedly captured over 800 Japanese soldiers from a single fortified position. He had approached their commanding officer and convinced him that it was more honorable to surrender and save his men's lives than to have them all die for nothing. Gabaldon was nicknamed the Pied Piper of Saipan. His actions undoubtedly saved hundreds of American lives that would have been lost in clearing out those caves. He also saved the lives of the Japanese who surrendered. He was a one-man psychological operations unit. His bravery was not just in facing the enemy, it was in his willingness to disobey orders, to take a huge personal risk, and to try a completely unconventional approach based on empathy and understanding. His story is told in his autobiography, Saipan, Suicide Island. He was initially awarded the Silver Star for his actions. But many, including himself, felt he deserved the Medal of Honor. For decades, he and his supporters campaigned for his award to be upgraded. It never was. He was eventually awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration. But what are the mysteries that remain? How did he really develop such a deep understanding of the Japanese psyche? What were the specific conversations he had in the dark, outside those caves, that convinced battle-hardened soldiers to lay down their arms? And why, despite the overwhelming evidence of his incredible feat and the number of lives he saved, was he never awarded the Medal of Honor? Was it because of his unorthodox methods, or was it because of his ethnicity? Number 9, who watches the Watchers? The war in the Pacific was a war of islands, and islands meant jungles, dense, hot, disease-ridden jungles. For the Allies fighting in places like the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the jungle itself was an enemy. But hiding within that jungle was a secret weapon. The Coast Watchers, they were a small, incredibly brave group of men who stayed behind on islands that had been captured by the Japanese. Their job was to watch and report. They were mostly Australian military officers, New Zealanders, and British district officers. Many had lived in these islands for years before the war. They knew the terrain and the local people. They set up hidden observation posts, often on high mountains overlooking key channels and airfields. With a simple radio, a code book, and a pair of binoculars, they became the eyes and ears of the Allied forces. Their life was one of constant danger and isolation. They were hunted relentlessly by the Japanese. If caught, they faced certain torture and execution. They lived off the land, constantly on the move, and were plagued by malaria and other tropical diseases. Their survival depended entirely on the loyalty of the local islanders who fed them, hid them, and acted as their scouts. The bravery of these islanders who risked their own lives and the lives of their entire villages to help the Coast Watchers is a story in itself. The intelligence they provided was vital. One of the most famous examples was a Coast Watcher named Paul Mason on the island of Bougainville. From his hidden post, he watched the Japanese airbase below. Every time a wave of bombers took off to attack the American forces on Guadalcanal, Mason would radio a simple message: 40 bombers headed yours. This gave the American fighters on Guadalcanal a critical 2-hour warning. It was enough time to get their planes in the air and ready to intercept the attack. Admiral William Bull Halsey, the U.S. commander in the South Pacific, later said that the intelligence from the Coast Watchers saved Guadalcanal, and Guadalcanal saved the Pacific. Another Coast Watcher, Jack Reed, also on Bougainville, spotted the flotilla of Japanese ships carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. His report led to the American ambush that shot down Yamamoto's plane, a major blow to Japanese morale. The story of these men is detailed in books like The Coast Watchers by Eric Felt, their commander. The bravery of the Coast Watchers was a quiet, lonely kind of courage. It wasn't about a single heroic charge. It was about enduring months, sometimes years, of constant fear, sickness, and solitude, knowing that a single mistake could mean death. It was the bravery of trust, both in their fellow operatives and in the local people who sheltered them. But so much of their work was secret, and many records are gone. What were the names of the hundreds of local islanders who were killed by the Japanese for helping them? How did the Coast Watchers cope with the immense psychological pressure of being hunted day and night? And were there other, even more crucial intelligence reports they sent that are still classified or lost to history? Reports that changed the course of battles we know little about. Number 8, how can a language be a weapon? In the early part of the war, the Japanese had a terrifying advantage. They were brilliant at breaking American military codes. They could anticipate troop movements, learn about supply routes, and set ambushes. The U.S. military was desperate for a code that the enemy couldn't crack. They tried complex machine-based ciphers. They tried using obscure languages. Nothing worked for long. The solution came from an unlikely place. Philip Johnston, the son of a missionary who grew up on the Navajo reservation, had an idea. He was a World War I veteran, and he knew the Navajo language. It was a complex, unwritten language with a syntax and tonal quality that made it almost impossible for an outsider to learn. He proposed to the Marine Corps that they use Navajo as the basis for a code. The Marines were skeptical, but they were also desperate. So they agreed to a test. In early 1942, they recruited 29 Navajo men. This first group developed the code. It had 2 parts. First, they created a dictionary of military terms that were given Navajo code words. A submarine became Iron Fish Beshlo. A battleship was Holotso. A fighter plane was Hummingbird Dahitehi. For words that weren't in the dictionary, they used a spelling system. They assigned a Navajo word to each letter of the English alphabet. For example, the letter A could be represented by the Navajo words for Wolachi, Apo Bilasana, or Waxte Nil. This made the code incredibly hard to break because the same letter could be transmitted using different words. These Navajo men became the code talkers. They were deployed to the front lines of every major marine assault in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. They worked in pairs, transmitting and receiving critical messages in the heat of battle. They sent information about enemy positions, directed artillery fire, and coordinated troop movements. They could send and receive a message in a matter of seconds. A machine would have taken 30 minutes. Their work was fast, accurate, and secure. The Japanese, who were masters of cryptanalysis, never broke the code. It was a perfect weapon. The bravery of the code talkers was immense. They weren't just sitting in a safe room. They were on the beaches, in the foxholes, right in the middle of the fighting. They had to be brave not only in the face of the enemy, but also in the face of their own comrades. Many of them were mistaken for Japanese soldiers by other Marines and had to be assigned bodyguards to protect them. Their story, for a long time, was a secret. The program was classified until 1968. The full story is told in books like Code Talker by Chester Nez, one of the original 29. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer of the 5th Marine Division on Iwo Jima, said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." During the first 48 hours of that battle, they transmitted over 800 messages without a single error. But what parts of their story remain untold because the program was secret for so long? Many of the code talkers' personal experiences in battle went unrecorded. What were the messages that turned the tide of smaller, forgotten skirmishes? How did they deal with the incredible irony of using their native language to defend a country that had, for centuries, tried to eradicate it? And were there other smaller code-talking programs using other Native American languages that have been completely lost to history? Number 7. What is the price of a turning point? June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway. It is often called the turning point of the Pacific War. In a single day, the U.S. Navy crippled the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of its aircraft carriers. But that victory came at a terrible cost, and no one paid a higher price than the men of Torpedo Squadron 8. They flew the Douglas TBD Devastator. It was a tragically outdated torpedo bomber. It was slow, poorly armored, and its torpedoes were notoriously unreliable. On the morning of the battle, Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from the carrier USS Hornet, was the first to find the Japanese fleet. They were supposed to have fighter cover, but something went wrong. They lost contact with their escort. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, had a choice. He could turn back and try to find his fighters, or he could press the attack alone. He chose to attack. His 15 planes descended toward the Japanese carriers. They had to fly low and slow in a straight line to drop their torpedoes. It was a suicide run. The Japanese carriers launched their Zero fighters, the sky filled with anti-aircraft fire. The Devastators were torn to shreds. One by one, they were shot down. They were too slow to evade, too poorly armed to fight back. Not a single one of their torpedoes hit a target. All 15 planes of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet were shot down. Of the 30 men in the squadron, only one survived, Ensign George Gay. His plane was shot down, and he floated in the water, hiding under a seat cushion as the battle raged around him. It sounds like a complete and tragic failure, but it wasn't. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and the other 2 torpedo squadrons from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown, who made similar costly attacks, was crucial. They pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level. They made the Japanese carriers maneuver wildly to avoid the torpedoes. They kept the Japanese flight decks busy and unable to launch their own counterstrike against the American carriers. And at that exact moment, as the last of the torpedo bombers were being shot down, American dive bombers, led by Commander C. Wade McCluskey, arrived high above. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet and were almost out of fuel. They found it at its most vulnerable moment. The Japanese fighters were at low altitude. The flight decks were covered with planes and fuel lines. The American dive bombers screamed down unopposed. In the space of 5 minutes, they hit and fatally wounded 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. The story is a powerful lesson in how sacrifice can lead to victory. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 knew their chances were slim to none. Their bravery was in doing their duty anyway. Their story is a centerpiece of any account of Midway, such as Walter Lord's classic, Incredible Victory. John C. Waldron had written a letter to his men the night before the battle. He told them, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." They all tried, but what are the unanswered questions? What were the final radio transmissions from those planes as they went down one by one? We have Ensign Gay's account, but what did the other 29 men see and feel in their last moments? And what was the exact nature of the communication breakdown that sent them in without fighter cover? Was it just the fog of war, or was there a specific mistake made that sent those men to their deaths? Number 6. What is a soldier's greatest fear? For the American soldiers who had survived the Bataan Death March and years of captivity, their greatest fear was not dying in the prison camp. It was that they would be forgotten. By late 1944, as American forces advanced across the Philippines, the Japanese issued a terrifying order. As soon as the Americans landed, all remaining prisoners of war were to be executed. The men in the Cabanatuan camp knew their time was running out. Back at U.S. headquarters, intelligence reports confirmed this fear. A daring, high-risk mission was planned. The job was given to the 6th Ranger Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci. They were to travel 30 miles behind enemy lines, link up with Filipino guerrillas, assault the Cabanatuan camp, and rescue the 500-plus prisoners. It was an incredibly complex operation. Failure meant the death of the prisoners and the Rangers. On January 30th, 1945, the raid began. Over 120 Rangers and Alamo Scouts, assisted by hundreds of Filipino guerrillas, made their way through the jungle. The guerrillas, under the command of Captains Juan Pajota and Eduardo Joson, were essential. They knew the terrain. They gathered intelligence on the Japanese guards, and during the raid, they set up roadblocks to hold off any Japanese reinforcements. As the sun set, the Rangers crawled on their bellies across a wide open field toward the camp. To distract the guards, a P-61 Black Widow night fighter buzzed the camp, a pre-arranged diversion. And then the Rangers opened fire. The assault was swift and brutal. In 30 minutes, they had secured the camp and killed the majority of the Japanese guards. Now came the hardest part, getting the prisoners out. The men were skeletons. They were weak from starvation and disease. Many couldn't walk. The Rangers had to carry them, support them, and urge them on. They used local Filipino villagers' ox carts to transport the weakest men. For 2 days, they made their way back to American lines, protected by the Filipino guerrillas who fought off several Japanese counterattacks. The raid was a stunning success. Over 500 prisoners were freed. Only 2 Rangers were killed in the action. The story is told in gripping detail in Hampton Sides' Ghost Soldiers. It was an act of incredible bravery on multiple levels. The courage of the Rangers to go deep behind enemy lines. The courage of the Filipino guerrillas who made the mission possible. And the quiet, desperate courage of the prisoners who, after years of hopelessness, had to find the strength for one last journey to freedom. But what about the details? We'll never know. The plan relied heavily on the Filipino guerrilla network. How many of those local fighters died in the skirmishes, holding back the Japanese reinforcements? Their names are mostly lost to history. What was the exact content of the intelligence that spurred the raid, and how close were the prisoners to actually being executed? And for the rescued prisoners, what was the psychological journey back to a world that had moved on without them for 3 long years? Number 5. How do you fight an entire fleet? October 25th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The U.S. was in the process of invading the Philippines. The Japanese Navy, in a desperate final gamble, launched a complex plan to destroy the American landing force. Part of this plan involved a decoy force of carriers luring the main American fleet under Admiral Halsey away to the north. It worked. Halsey took the bait, leaving the landing beaches protected by little more than a handful of small, slow escort carriers and their screen of destroyers and even smaller destroyer escorts. This small group of ships was codenamed Taffy 3. They were never meant to fight battleships. Their job was to support the troops on the ground. But on that morning, they looked up to see the main Japanese battle fleet, the center force, bearing down on them. It was a fleet of battleships and heavy cruisers, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. It was a force that should have annihilated Taffy 3 in minutes. The commander of Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, couldn't believe his eyes. He radioed for help, but Halsey was too far away. They were on their own. What happened next is one of the most incredible stories of naval warfare. Faced with certain destruction, Taffy 3 didn't run. They turned and charged. The destroyers, like the USS Johnston, captained by Commander Ernest Evans, laid down smoke screens and then raced toward the giant Japanese ships, zigzagging to avoid massive shells. They got in close and fired their torpedoes. The tiny destroyer escorts, ships even smaller than destroyers, which sailors joked were tin cans, did the same. The pilots from the escort carriers took off in their slow planes, some with no bombs, and made strafing runs on the bridges of the Japanese battleships to distract them. The fight was a chaotic, brutal mismatch. The USS Johnston was hit repeatedly but kept fighting until it was dead in the water. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort, fought so tenaciously it was known as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. It took on a heavy cruiser and scored a torpedo hit before being sunk. The battle raged for over 2 hours. The ships of Taffy 3 were savaged, but their furious, suicidal attack worked. They sowed so much confusion and did just enough damage that the Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, became convinced he was facing a much larger American force. He thought he had stumbled into Halsey's main fleet. Fearing a trap and that his own ships were being worn down, he made a baffling decision. He turned his fleet around and retreated. Taffy 3 had held. They had saved the invasion fleet, but the cost was immense. 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort were sunk. Over 1,000 American sailors were killed. The story is brilliantly told in James D. Hornfisher's The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. Ernest Evans of the Johnston was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But what mysteries still surround that battle? What was truly going on in Admiral Kurita's mind? Why did he turn back when victory was in his grasp? Do any of his personal records or logs survive that shed light on his decision? And from the American side, in the chaos of battle and smoke, what were the individual acts of heroism on those sinking ships that were never seen and never reported? Number 4, how do you fly to a place you can't return from? In the spring of 1942, America needed a victory. The months since Pearl Harbor had been dark. The news was all bad. The country's morale was sinking. President Roosevelt wanted a way to strike back at Japan, to show them they were not untouchable. But there was a problem. American bombers didn't have the range to reach Japan and return. A wild idea was born. What if they took medium bombers, B-25s, which were normally land-based, and flew them off an aircraft carrier? It had never been done before. A B-25 was far too big and heavy. The plan was to sail a carrier as close to Japan as possible, have the bombers take off, drop their bombs on Tokyo and other cities, and then fly onto land in friendly parts of China. It was a one-way trip. The mission was entrusted to Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle, a famous aviator. He gathered 80 volunteers. These men knew the risks. They trained for weeks, learning to take off in a dangerously short distance. They stripped the planes of everything non-essential to save weight and add extra fuel tanks. On April 18, 1942, the plan was put into motion. The carrier USS Hornet, escorted by the fleet, was sailing toward Japan when it was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat. They were still hundreds of miles farther from Japan than they had planned. Their fuel would be dangerously low. Doolittle had to make a decision launch now, or scrub the mission. He chose to launch. One by one, the 16 B-25s roared down the short flight deck of the Hornet and lumbered into the air. It was a miracle that they all made it. They flew for hours at low altitude to avoid detection. They reached Japan and dropped their bombs. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was immense. The Japanese people had been told their homeland was invulnerable. The Doolittle raid proved that was a lie. It was a huge boost to American morale, but for the 80 airmen, the mission was far from over. They were out of fuel, it was dark, the weather was bad. All 16 planes either crash-landed in China or were ditched in the sea. 3 men were killed in the crashes, 8 were captured by the Japanese, 3 of them were executed, and another died in captivity. The rest were helped by Chinese civilians and missionaries who risked their own lives to hide them from the Japanese. In retaliation for this help, the Japanese army swept through the Chinese provinces where the airmen landed, killing an estimated 250,000 civilians. The Doolittle raid was an act of incredible calculated bravery. The men knew from the start they probably wouldn't make it back. It was a mission driven by ingenuity and sheer nerve. Ted W. Lawson's book, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, gives a first-hand account of the raid and the harrowing escape through China. But the full story has gaps. What was the true extent of the Japanese reprisal against the Chinese civilians? The number of 250,000 is an estimate. The real toll may never be known. What happened to the individual Chinese people who helped the American flyers? Most of their names and fates are lost. And what was the private, internal debate within the Japanese high command after the raid? How much did this single small attack truly change their strategic thinking? Number 3, how do you become a legend? Some men are just born to fight. John Basilone was one of them. He was a Marine sergeant from New Jersey. He had already served in the army in the Philippines before the war. When the war started, he joined the Marines. He ended up on an island that would become a symbol of the Pacific War's brutal, grinding nature, Guadalcanal. In October 1942, Basilone was in charge of 2 heavy machine gun sections. They were defending a critical airfield. The Japanese launched a massive frontal assault. For 2 days, under constant attack, Basilone and his men held their ground. At one point, one of his gun crews was wiped out. Basilone picked up the 90-pound machine gun and its tripod, ran with it to the position, and got it back in action. When his ammunition ran low, he ran through enemy fire to get more. When a gun jammed, he fixed it under fire. He fought for nearly 48 hours without sleep or food. By the end of the battle, he was one of only 3 men left in his section. He had held the line. For his actions on Guadalcanal, John Basilone was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was sent home a hero. He went on a war bond tour. He was famous. He could have stayed home for the rest of the war safe, but he hated it. He felt guilty being celebrated while his friends were still fighting and dying. He requested to go back to the front. The Marine Corps tried to deny him, saying he was more valuable at home. He insisted. They finally agreed on the condition that he not be sent on the most dangerous missions. He ended up at the next iconic battle, Iwo Jima. On the first day of the invasion, February 19th, 1945, his unit was pinned down on the beach by heavy fire from a Japanese blockhouse. Sergeant Basilone wasn't supposed to be on the front line, but he went anyway. He worked his way around the enemy position single-handedly, destroyed it with grenades and demolitions, and got his men off the beach. A few moments later, he was killed by an artillery shell. John Basilone is the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross, which he was awarded posthumously for Iwo Jima. His story is one of pure, unadulterated combat courage. He wasn't a general or a pilot. He was a sergeant who led from the front and never asked his men to do something he wouldn't do himself. His story is a major part of the HBO series The Pacific, and is detailed in books like I'm Staying with My Boys, The Heroic Life of Sergeant John Basilone by James Brady. He chose to go back, he chose to lead from the front, and he paid the ultimate price. But even with a legend like Basilone, there are questions. What was he really like as a person away from the battlefield? The legend often obscures the man. What were the names of the men in his machine gun crew on Guadalcanal who died beside him? Their bravery was just as real, but their stories are largely forgotten. And what were his final thoughts on that beach at Iwo Jima, having survived so much, only to fall at the very beginning of another battle? Number 2, could a man who wouldn't touch a gun be the bravest of all? Desmond Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist. His faith was deeply important to him. He believed the 10 Commandments were absolute. Thou shalt not kill meant thou shalt not kill, period. When he was drafted into the Army in 1942, he registered as a conscientious objector. He was willing to serve his country, but he would not carry a weapon. The Army didn't know what to do with him. He was sent to basic training, and his refusal to touch a rifle made him an outcast. His fellow soldiers mocked him. They called him a coward. They threw things at him while he prayed. His commanding officers tried to have him discharged for being mentally unfit. They tried to court-martial him for disobeying a direct order to carry a weapon, but Doss wouldn't budge. He wanted to be a medic. He wanted to save lives, not take them. He eventually got his wish. He was assigned as a combat medic to the 77th Infantry Division. In 1945, they were sent to Okinawa, the site of one of the war's bloodiest battles. The 77th was tasked with capturing a 400-foot high cliff called the Maeda Escarpment. The soldiers called it Hacksaw Ridge. The top was a flat plateau, defended by a deeply entrenched Japanese force. The fighting was horrific. On May 5th, 1945, the Americans made a major assault on the ridge. They were hit with a ferocious counterattack. The American soldiers were forced to retreat back down the cliff face, but dozens of wounded men were left behind on top of the ridge, trapped in the line of fire. One man stayed with them. It was Desmond Doss. Unarmed, he ran from one wounded soldier to another, treating their injuries, all while under constant enemy fire. And then he did something incredible. One by one, he dragged the wounded men to the edge of the cliff. He fashioned a rope sling and, by himself, lowered each man down to safety below. For hours he worked alone. He later said that with each man he lowered, he would pray, "Lord, please help me get one more." He kept going until he had rescued every single one he could find. The official estimate for his Medal of Honor citation was 75 men. Doss himself thought it was closer to 50. The other men at the bottom of the cliff were sure it was over 100. His bravery was almost superhuman. A few weeks later, he was wounded 4 times in a single night attack, including a serious injury from a grenade. Even then, as he was being carried off on a stretcher, he saw another man who was more seriously wounded, rolled off his stretcher, and told the medics to take the other guy first. The story of Desmond Doss, the conscientious objector who became one of the war's greatest heroes, is told in the film Hacksaw Ridge, and the book The Unlikeliest Hero by Bhutan Herndon. But what are the lingering unknowns in his story? We know he saved 75 men, but how many others did he treat who didn't make it? What was the psychological toll on a man who saw so much death but refused to cause it? And in the years after the war, did he ever reconnect with the men whose lives he saved on that ridge? And what did they say to the coward who had carried them to safety? Number 1. What does courage look like when no one is watching? The war in the Pacific was not just fought by soldiers in uniform, it was fought by ordinary people who were caught in the middle. After the fall of the Philippines in 1942, the Japanese occupation began. It was a brutal time, but many Filipinos refused to accept defeat. A vast and effective resistance movement sprang up across the islands. These were the guerrillas. They were a mix of Filipino soldiers who had refused to surrender, American soldiers who had escaped capture, and ordinary civilians, farmers, teachers, doctors, and students. They had few weapons, little food, and almost no medical supplies. They fought a shadow war in the jungles and mountains. They ambushed Japanese patrols, sabotaged supply lines, and gathered crucial intelligence that they relayed to the Allies by secret radio. Their bravery was a constant daily choice. Every day they risked not just their own lives, but the lives of their families and their entire villages. The Japanese response to guerrilla activity was swift and merciless. For every Japanese soldier killed, entire villages were often burned to the ground and their inhabitants executed. To be a guerrilla was to live with constant fear. One of the most remarkable figures of the resistance was a woman named Magdalena Leones. She was a Filipina school teacher and the daughter of a preacher. She became an intelligence officer working as a special agent for the U.S. Army forces in the Philippines' northern Luzon. She carried messages, medical supplies, and radio parts through enemy-held territory. She was so effective at gathering intelligence on enemy positions and troop movements that she was awarded the Silver Star by the U.S. government. She is believed to be the only Asian woman to have received that award for her actions in World War II. She was arrested and interrogated by the Japanese 3 times, but she never broke. The cumulative effect of the Filipino resistance was enormous. As documented in books like The War in the Pacific, the Philippines, by a team of historians, the guerrillas tied down huge numbers of Japanese troops who could have been used elsewhere. When General MacArthur finally returned to the Philippines in 1944, he found that the guerrillas had already liberated large parts of the islands. Their intelligence was vital to the success of the American landings. This was bravery without parades or medals for most. It was the quiet, stubborn courage of a farmer hiding a wounded American pilot. It was the bravery of a woman like Magdalena Leones walking through a Japanese checkpoint with secret documents hidden in her clothing. It was the courage of a whole people who refused to be conquered. But because it was a secret war, so much of its history is lost. How many thousands of Una named Filipino civilians were executed for helping the resistance? What were the names of the guerrilla leaders of small local bands who fought and died in the remote mountains? And what were the moral compromises these fighters had to make, living in the shadows, where the line between right and wrong was often blurred by the necessities of survival? Their stories are the foundation of the Pacific War, a testament to the fact that the greatest bravery is often found far from any official battlefield when no one is watching.